Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for July 11th, 2024. Today we're going to be taking a look at NATO and its attempt to contain or go to war with China, as has been discussed at the ongoing summit in Washington, D.C. Behind the smiles of the NATO officials, they're grinding their teeth. Behind the artificial cordiality, they can't hide their panic. They've been outflanked. Their unipolar order is no longer viable, and it's being challenged by a coalition of nations, including those of the global south, the BRICS countries led by Russia, China, and India, that are presenting an unprecedented challenge to the idea that there is a unipolar order that represents the interests of the whole world, enforced by the sole superpower of the United States. The nations of the global south and the BRICS are no longer willing to submit to this power. And we're seeing through the problems the NATO forces are having in Ukraine that their military power is overstated. Now, they're going to try to recover using military operations, blackmail, threats, and so on. But to do so, they have to divert funds from necessary expenditures in their own countries. And this is leading to a tremendous anger in the population, in which governments are being thrown out or are registering just barely above single digits in the polls. Because when you start taking money out of healthcare and education and infrastructure to fund a war machine that's losing a war, the people tend to get angry, and legitimately so. But the NATO war hawks refuse to face reality. When you try to defeat a nuclear power, such as Russia, you risk nuclear war. And anything short of nuclear war, you have the risk of losing, as is the case in Ukraine, where the Western powers are losing the war. But the sacrifice is being paid by the Ukrainians, but also by the population in the West that doesn't support the war. Now, this real frustration was expressed by a NATO propagandist, the CEO of the Atlantic Council, Frederick Kemp, in an article he wrote on the day of the opening of the NATO summit. It's his Inflection Points column, and the title is Putin, Xi, Orban, and Modi provide a disturbing backdrop to the start of the NATO summit. Now, what's he talking about? He's talking about the meetings that took place, that Putin, in launching a Eurasian strategic architecture, the meetings between Putin and Xi, Putin and Modi, Putin and Orban, Orban and Xi, that all of this reflected an alternative reality that's outside of the control of NATO. And the reality is that this security architecture that Putin is talking about is security and economic cooperation, economic development. And it's inclusive, not exclusionary. But it's outside of the control, or increasingly outside of the control of the NATO powers, including the financial operations that are facilitating trade and investment. Now, with all these meetings taking place, there was one honest assessment. Bloomberg had an article on the Modi-Putin meeting where Modi and Putin were engaged in a very strong embrace, and it's titled, Modi-Putin Embrace Highlights Failure to Isolate Russia. Now, is this a failure by miscalculation? No, Helga Zepp-LaRouche said it's an arrogant delusion. Remember, Biden said, I'm running the world. Well, he may have an excuse in his diminished mental capacity. But what is NATO discussing? And I'm going to go through a couple of the points. One, the ultimate goal is to get Ukraine into NATO. They're having trouble figuring out how to do that. But this has been a provocation to Russia since 2008. And now they're talking about it again. But the other thing that was discussed in the summit yesterday was the expansion of NATO to Asia Pacific, the so-called global NATO perspective. And what is this? It's a preparation for war with China, a war which U.S. military experts say cannot be won. Now, they're trying to build on the AUKUS agreement, the Australia, UK, US agreement. Let me quote you from Stoltenberg, the outgoing General Secretary of NATO, who talked about the importance of bringing in Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand into NATO. He said, "We will meet with the heads of federal government from our Asia-Pacific partners, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea. And the war in Ukraine demonstrates how our security is interlinked, because Iran, North Korea, and China are the main enablers of Russia's war against Ukraine." Now, in the process of this discussion, they're talking about the Pacific deployment of NATO forces. Now, this was responded to by a Chinese official, Lin Jian, who's a foreign ministry spokesman. Listen to what he said, because it gives you a sense that what Stoltenberg and NATO are talking about with China is far removed from the reality of China. Lin Jian said that the alliance should abandon its Cold War mentality. He said, as a vestige of the Cold War and the world's biggest military bloc, NATO claims itself to be a regional defense alliance on the one hand, but on the other hand keeps reaching beyond its boundary, expanding its mandate, stoking confrontation, and acting like a bully on the world stage. NATO's so-called security is more often than not built on others' insecurity. And he goes on to say, China is a force for world peace, a contributor to global development, and a defender of international order. Our objective and just position and constructive role on the Ukraine crisis, and the Chinese have put forward a peace proposal, and on other international and regional hotspots are widely recognized by the international community. We urge NATO to form the right perception of China, get rid of its Cold War mentality and zero-sum approach, stop scaremongering on security and making imaginary enemies, stop forming exclusive clubs in the name of collective defense, and play a constructive role for global peace, stability, and development. So trying to contain China is an act of war. On the other hand, as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has insisted, the West could easily join the BRICS alliance and be part of a growing cooperative effort for economic development. Now, how do you change the attitude toward China? Well, Scott Ritter has a very interesting interview with Global Times, the Chinese paper, on July 9th. I'm going to read a little bit of it because he says that the image that's presented of China in the Western press is that it's a regional bully. And he said, Americans know very little about China. In fact, he said they're ignorant on China. But he said there is a way to break through that ignorance. China needs to allow more Americans to come there, to expose them to the reality of the country. This should be done not by telling Americans what China is, but by letting them discover China for themselves and learn about it. And he goes on to say, I think China is very proud of what it has become, the nation it is, and the contributions it has made to the world. Then Ritter continues, once we, meaning Americans, see the truth about China, we will be in a better position to evaluate the misinformation being spread by our government, and then pressure our government to learn to live in peace and harmony with China. If we view the Chinese as normal, rational people and show respect for their culture and history, there will be no need for confrontation. Instead, the focus will be on peaceful cooperation and coexistence rather than confrontation. Very wise words from Scott Ritter. The same principle expressed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche repeatedly, saying that Americans need to learn about other cultures and other nations' history to avoid being manipulated by the hybrid warfare operations being conducted against them by NATO and the war hawks. I think Scott Ritter's contribution here is important. The NATO summit is going to continue. It's a very dangerous thing. Unfortunately, we're seeing President Biden up there cheerleading it. I'll have more on it tomorrow, and also I'll take your questions, because for Friday's questions, send them to me at harleysch@gmail.com. There's also the interview I did with Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, which will be linked in the description section.
The big question, what can we do about it? If we have the power to influence the course of history as individuals, then each of us has a corresponding moral responsibility to muster from within ourselves those capacities which enable us to do our part in shaping the course of civilization. Now, under that rubric, I say, what kind of news is newsworthy? The only news that's worth having is news which performs those functions, which enables government, which enables you as an individual and so forth, better to understand what is happening to this planet, to understand what the developments are that are shaping the course of history, and finally to indicate to you the facts which you need to look at so that you can judge what it is that you might be able to do which can contribute to bringing about a solution, an escape from the collapse of civilization. This is no pipe dream, this is no fantasy, this is real.